Good morning, everyone. Welcome to LastPass's new LinkedIn Live show, the Passwordless POV. I'm technology correspondent Lisa Martin. So excited that you're here. Today's topic is pervasive passwordless protection, and our first guest on the inaugural episode is none other than Karim Toubba, the CEO of LastPass. Karim, welcome to the program. Great to have you.
Thanks for having me, Lisa. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, and Karim's going to tell us where he is in just a second. Basically, we're going to have a conversation with you for about 15 minutes. We'd love for you to join the conversation, pop in questions, comments, all that good stuff. Karim's going to give us a market update. We're going to be talking about the rise of cyber attacks, not news, right? What that can be attributed to. There's a hint, the compromised credentials crisis. He's going to give us some really interesting stats on the market, what's going on. He's then going to define the passwordless future, what that looks like, what that means for you and your organization. And then finally, Karim's going to leave it with some great proof points from the voices of LastPass customers, really talking about the benefits that LastPass Technologies is going to deliver to your organization. Karim, first of all, go ahead and start us off with where you are today.
Yeah, great. So I'm live at Black Hat here in Las Vegas, one of the largest security shows, and it's early in the morning, so hopefully there won't be too much distraction, but a lot of energy and excitement around the activity of the event.
Awesome. I love that. So let's go ahead and start with a market update. We know the rise of cyber attacks is almost daily headlines, can be attributed to the hint I gave, compromised credential crisis. Passwords are a problem. What's going on in the market? What are you seeing from your lens?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think what we're seeing, generally speaking, as the number of attacks and high profile breaches continue to be prevalent, there's a lot of work and research done that are effectively retrospectives on what is the cause as part of the kill chain, i.e. different steps of the attack path as part of the incident retrospective. And one of the things we see, and there's a lot of data written about this, is it's really tied to the compromised credential crisis. What is that? It means at some point in time during the kill chain of a successful attack, a breach, and exfiltration, the attackers actually used compromised credentials as a way to either move laterally, access a system, or exfiltrate data. As a matter of fact, the numbers show that about 86% of successful breaches at some point in time in the kill chain actually use compromised credentials in that. So it's pretty interesting data to sort of support the fact that organizations are spending a lot of time thinking through how do they mitigate against that, and how do they ensure that any kind of credentials across the board can be secured more pervasively. And the other piece that's also important is that one of the reasons, and there are many different sort of attack profiles, but one of the reasons is, if you look at the data, about 62 or 63% of us as users tend to reuse the passwords or small variations of the password in different sites. And that lends itself to really creating different type of attack patterns that attackers take advantage of.
Right. The human element is challenging. I was reading that 74% of breaches involve that human element. How is that from a behavioral perspective, from a cultural perspective? That's hard for people to change.
It is. But to change it, you sort of have to understand the root of it, right? I mean, if you think about what actually happens, it's probably not surprising the number's higher. Because there's always the human element. But if you think about you or I going out to a site and creating a username and a password, we're not likely going to create something that's really long, really strong, totally random, and not susceptible to attack paths like brute force attacks or dictionary attacks. And what we're going to do is we're going to want the ability to probably use the same password for different sites, because I personally am not likely going to remember 200 different username and password variations. And so that is the opportunity that attackers are taking advantage of. So you can really understand why that is. And the question is, how do you actually use new technologies like passwordless to address that and solve the problem?
What about ransomware? Where is that a factor? I talked about, cybersecurity. We're hearing about breaches almost on the daily. Nobody wants to become the next headline. But where's ransomware as a factor in all of this?
Yeah, I mean, look, we see a rise in ransomware across the board, whether it's generic ransomware or mechanisms that enable ransomware that then drive the right kind of outcome for the attacker or the wrong kind of outcome for organizations. And so it's a prevalent piece across the board and something that organizations have to really pay attention to as they sort of build a more comprehensive security strategy, starting with the user and the endpoint, all the way through the security of their infrastructure for the critical data that is often susceptible to ransomware.
Right, right. What are some, when you must have lots of customer conversations every year. What are some of the pervasive challenges that they're facing? And like, for example, where does the hybrid workforce come into play here?
Yeah, there's quite a few challenges. We spend a fair bit of time talking to our customers. We're very fortunate at LastPass. We've got about over 110,000 business customers, from ranging from small organizations to Fortune 1000s. And so as part of that discourse and conversations, we really try to spend time understanding what their challenges are and what happens. And it really sort of boils down to a few things. Number one is as the world sort of evolves and you have a very hybrid workforce and you have users that are using applications across the board, how do you unify the authentication mechanism? Organizations have adopted single sign-on for quite some time, but that covers 60, maybe 70% of the applications that the organizations use. The second biggest issue that they deal with is, if you think about it, each functional area, sales, HR, legal, IT, engineering, has their new latest productivity applications that they're bringing into the organizations to achieve better results, drive more efficiency in the business and productivity. And what that means is it creates an environment in which applications that are not within the SSO framework have to be used. And so the biggest challenge is, how do you enable security at a minimum level in that organization, but at the same time, how do you ensure convenience and adaptability for the user? And that's sort of like this tried-true tension that has happened between adaptability and convenience versus security for many years.
That brings us right into our second subject, which is the passwordless future. You talked some really, really impressive, I should say, staggering statistics about what's going on in the market, the human element. What does the passwordless future, first of all, define it for us? What does it look like?
Yeah. So passwordless is effectively using a mechanism called passkeys, which use public-private key pairs to actually authenticate the user, and then upstream tying the user biometrics, Face ID, Touch ID, thumbprint, things of those nature. So now, instead of passing a credential like my username and password that I have to remember, I pass something I am. In the world of authentication, there are three variables in the equation that you can authenticate with: something you have, something you know, or something you are. Something you are is the biometric. And so now, with the pervasive deployment of smartphones and fingerprint capabilities on laptops, you can actually use biometrics as a way to authenticate the user themselves and then not have to use a password. And that opens up a tremendous amount of things, both from a convenience perspective to the user, but also security perspective to the IT and security organization itself.
Got it. So then talk about what LastPass is doing to lead the charge into passwordless. Give me a little bit of a history. You guys launched in 2022, the LastPass Authenticator, kind of the foray into the passwordless world. But give us that perspective and what you guys are doing to be leaders there.
Yeah, we've been at this for a while. I will start by basically saying, on any organization's journey to passwordless, and it is just that, because these are things that standards, technologies that evolve and take time. Like many of these industry transitions, these things typically tend to take years. So organizations need to really sort of be mindful of what that transition looks like, where they are today, what they're attempting to do over the course of the next 6 months, and eventually where things headed in the future. And if you think about implementation of passwords, there's sort of two sides to the coin. There's the application and server side that has to have some changes made to the underlying code to support passkeys and passwordless. And then there's the client side. A lot of the work that we've been doing started well over a year ago. So we had traditionally had an enterprise vault where users can log into the vault and store all of their usernames and passwords for any sites that they used. And we put a lot of policies around that. The first thing that we did last year is we enabled biometric passwordless access to the vault. So now the user would log into a mobile vault, as an example, with their fingerprint, and then launch the site from within the vault. And then the vault would automatically pass the username and password to the application. That's the first thing we did, was passwordless access to the vault. A couple of months ago, we announced our intent to support passkeys and integrate passkeys into the vault that will be launching it to the market in Q4. What does that do? It basically means that instead of storing a username and a password, I can go to a site like Best Buy and use the vault to register myself as a user. And then the vault will, and LastPass will automatically generate the passkeys, store them securely, and then authenticate for the user completely transparently. And yesterday at Black Hat, we announced our full support for FIDO2 compliant devices. These are devices that use biometrics that can unlock the desktop vault, the web vault, and also the plugin for browsers. So that means that I can now have a new mechanism with both authenticators, but also tokens for organizations that are more security minded, things like Phaeton or YubiKeys. And then we enable the administrators to measure the policy and enforce the policy of what they actually need in order to unlock the vaults that will give them the ability to authenticate.
So what you guys are doing here and really evolving passwordless, how is that solving some of those pervasive challenges that you talked about in our first section that customers are dealing with on the daily?
Yeah. It goes back to what we said earlier, which is that this is a sort of a two-pronged or two sides of the coin value proposition. On one end of the spectrum, if you spend time talking to organizations, you realize that they spend an exorbitant amount of time doing things like password resets. They spend a fair bit of time trying to figure out a way to secure and drive policies to address that human behavior factor that we talked about earlier, which is how do I ensure that the users are I'm driving the right behavior with users. And on the user side, it's really about how do I get a consistent experience for all applications I'm accessing, regardless of whether or not I'm accessing the application with a username and password, or I'm accessing the application via passwordless and passkeys. So it's the ability to address both of those things simultaneously. And I think this is probably one of the most unique things about the promise of passwordless in the industry as a whole, which is that this is not just a technology that is facilitating, increasing security and facilitating administration for administrators and security professionals, but it is at the same time delivering on the promise of facilitating ease of use, one login, click in, one click login, and then giving the user the ability to have that uniformity across all applications that they access.
And how is this better than traditional security tools that organizations have been using for a long time?
Yeah, well, so first thing is it's consistent. So back to the point we made earlier, remember these transitions are going to take years to manifest themselves. So I'll give you a classic example. Today, I may go to, there's sort of two classes of applications, consumer applications, things like Netflix and Best Buy versus corporate applications. I use Netflix and Best Buy as an example because based on the last time I checked, Best Buy supports passkeys, Netflix does not. But as a user, I want to actually be able to go through and have the same passwordless experience. So what's different now is that with LastPass, I can put the username and password for Netflix in my vault and the passkeys for Best Buy in my vault. And then I open the vault with my thumb and biometrics. And then the vault actually passes either the passkeys or the usernames and password. The back end determines the authentication mechanism based on what's supported. But me as a user, the experience is completely passwordless to me. And that's the most critical part of the value and the differentiation that we are driving today.
So this is really going to be transformative for individuals, consumers, businesses in every industry. I'd love to move into our third and final topic here in our final minutes, Karim, and talk about the voices of LastPass customers. You guys have, you mentioned a huge number of organizations that are using LastPass on the business side. We know consumers are too. When you're in those customer conversations, what are some of the main benefits that customers are coming back to you saying, Karim, this is what we're achieving with LastPass and Passwordless?
Yeah, I think the first one is what they can do to provide a consistent experience for all of their users. And the reason that's important for businesses, remember back to the productivity conversation we had earlier. If I, as an IT or security professional, can provide a consistent experience that I know is going to enhance security, And that consistent experience is also going to facilitate the workflow for the user, make it 100% consistent regardless of which app they use. I'm likely going to get a lot more pull and much less resistance from my user base to actually deploy the technology. And that's a really critical piece, because getting user buy-in broadly across the organization, the less friction you have as an organization or as a technology enabler, the more likelihood you're going to have broad scale adoption and really going to have to drive users. The other piece that's really interesting is that there's an entire class of attack paths that we haven't talked about. The more technically minded folks will know things like credential stuffing, when you steal millions or thousands of passwords and then use that from one site to try to compromise credentials on another site or compromise accounts on another site. Dictionary attacks, brute force attacks. The underlying technology of passwordless really has the potential to significantly reduce and in some cases eliminate altogether different attack paths. So as a security professional, when I inside of an organization, what we hear is, great, you're giving me the ability to have consistency across the board. And on the other end of it, you're eliminating broad swaths of the attack surface area across that infrastructure as well. And so that ability to do both drives a tremendous amount of value and potential to IT and security teams as well.
Oh, it's going to be transformative. You mentioned the consistency of the experience a number of times. That's critical, especially one of the stats that you mentioned in terms of the human element. They're really critical. Leave us with a favorite customer story. You don't have to mention customer by name, that you think really shines the spotlight on LastPass, its value proposition, and the direction that you're going in passwordless.
Yeah, it's a good one. So look, I recently spoke to a customer that had been a longtime customer for us in the sort of traditional enterprise password space, and in that time frame, they had driven policies that allowed their IT security users to really enable them to store usernames and passwords to critical assets. Historically, in order to get access to the vault, we would have to, as an example, mobile vault, remember what was called the master password, the one password you use to actually unlock the vault. When we rolled out biometric access to the vault, they actually took that opportunity to say, okay, now you've created an environment where you've significantly reduced the friction for me to deploy this. And then they started to look at deployment across sales, HR, other functional areas, because with biometric, they know that they can now start to push credentials to HR applications, legal applications, sales applications into the vault. But then the user would simply have to use their biometric to log in to gain access to those applications. And that piece was the transformation that gave them the confidence and the ability to really sort of drive the kind of change more pervasively throughout the company.
And that's what organizations need, is that confidence key that can't be underestimated. Right. Karim, thank you so much for joining us on the inaugural episode of the Passwordless POV. We so appreciate you taking the time at Black Hat to give us a great market update, define the passwordless future, and how LastPass is enabling organizations across industries to achieve it. We really appreciate your time and your insights. We want to thank you so much for watching our inaugural episode. We can't wait to see you next month. Take care, everyone.
Bye now.